She was standing in her front garden, pruning roses, when the reporters arrived. She was 87 years old. She had just made a cup of tea. Her hands were steady, her voice was calm. The neighbors watching from behind their curtains knew her as a quiet widow who grew vegetables, attended peace marches, and sometimes argued about politics with rather more fire than you would expect from a woman her age. They thought they knew everything about her. They knew almost nothing, because what the tabloids descending on that quiet street in Bexleyheath in the autumn of 1999 had just discovered was this. The grey-haired grandmother tending her roses had spent 40 years passing top-secret British nuclear research to Soviet intelligence. She had done it out of conviction. She had done it with extraordinary discipline. She had done it so successfully that Moscow Center considered her among the most valuable agents they had ever run in the United Kingdom. Her K.G.B code name was Ola, and when they finally came for her, she was not frightened. She was annoyed that they had interrupted her morning. Her name was Melita Norwood, and this is the story of how the most dangerous British spy of the 20th century looked exactly like your grandmother, behaved exactly like your neighbor, and changed the nuclear history of the world without ever once being suspected. By the time you finish listening to this, you will understand why the most important thing about Melita Norwood is not what she stole. T is the question she leaves behind, the question that intelligence historians are still arguing about today. Did she betray her country? Or did she, in her own absolute ideological certainty, prevent the very war she feared most? Melita Cernes was born in 1912 in Bournemouth, the daughter of Latvian immigrants. Her father was a socialist. Her mother ran the household with quiet determination. The family had come to England carrying something beyond luggage, a deep, inherited conviction that the world was arranged unjustly, and that the working classes of Europe deserved far better than the system had given them. Melita grew up reading. She grew up thinking. She grew up watching the Great Depression hollow out the lives of people around her, and she drew the conclusion that many intelligent, earnest young people drew in the 1930s, that Soviet communism represented not a threat to civilization, but its best available hope. She joined the Communist Party of Great Britain at a time when doing so was not scandalous. Plenty of idealistic young people did the same. What made Melita different was the depth of her commitment. She was not a fellow traveler who attended meetings and drifted away when the cause became inconvenient. She believed, completely, that the Soviet Union represented a historical necessity, and she was willing to act on that belief. In 1935, she took a job as a secretary at the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association. It sounds utterly unremarkable. The association conducted industrial and metallurgical research. It was staffed by scientists and administrators. Nobody would give a secretary work in there a second glance, which was, for what came next, exactly the point. What the K.G.B handlers who approached Melita Norwood that same year understood, and what British security services badly failed to appreciate, was that her organization was about to become central to one of the most consequential scientific programs in human history. When the British government launched its own atomic weapons research effort in the 1940s, a program that fed directly into the broader Allied nuclear project, Melita Norwood's employer was embedded in the technical supply chain. Documents crossed her desk. Research moved through her hands. And for 4 decades, carefully, methodically, without a tremor of doubt, she photographed what she could, noted what she could not photograph, and passed it to her Soviet handlers at prearranged meetings in the streets and parks of suburban London. Here is what you need to understand about how Melita Norwood operated and why it is so remarkable. She was not trained in a K.G.B facility. She was not given a cover identity or a safe house or a dedicated communications network. She lived in the same house in Bexleyheath that she would occupy for the rest of her life. She continued her normal routines. She went to Communist Party meetings openly, because she always had. She tended her garden, she made marmalade, she babysat her grandchildren. She was, by every observable measure, an ordinary suburban Englishwoman of strongly left-wing political views, the sort of person that British intelligence in that era considered mildly eccentric but entirely harmless. That was not incompetence on her part, that was strategy. The greatest cover an agent can have is a life lived in open, unremarkable sight. A person who attracts no suspicion because there is genuinely nothing suspicious to observe. Melita Norwood understood, perhaps intuitively, perhaps through guidance from her handlers, that the best way to conceal an extraordinary secret was to live an aggressively ordinary life. She never attempted to access information beyond what crossed her desk naturally. She never lived above her means. She never took unexplained holidays to strange destinations. She never, in 40 years, made a single operational error significant enough to attract scrutiny. And here is where the story becomes uncomfortable for the intelligence establishment that missed her entirely. Melita Norwood was not missed primarily because she was clever, though she was. She was missed, in substantial part, because she was a woman, a middle-aged woman, a secretary. In the culture of British security services in the 1940s and 1950s, the profile of a dangerous Soviet agent was male. It was educated at the right universities, moved in the right social circles. It held positions of obvious strategic importance. The Cambridge spy ring, which British intelligence was consumed with unraveling for decades, fit that profile almost perfectly. Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Kim Philby, public school boys, Oxford and Cambridge men, officers and gentlemen who had bent their privilege toward Moscow. Nobody was looking at the secretary. Nobody considered that the woman making tea and filing reports might be photographing documents before she filed them. The assumption was so deeply embedded in the institutional culture that it was never really examined. Women in support roles were functionally invisible to the threat assessment machinery of British counterintelligence for most of the Cold War, and Melita Norwood used that invisibility with the precision of a professional. Her K.G.B. file, later reviewed by intelligence historians, describes her handling officers as deeply impressed by her reliability and her operational discipline. She passed material consistently. She maintained cover with no apparent difficulty. She asked for almost nothing in return. She rejected financial payment as an insult to her ideological purpose. She was, from Moscow's perspective, the ideal agent, motivated entirely by belief, costing almost nothing and completely invisible to the enemy. What exactly did she pass? This is where the historical record becomes both clearer and more sobering. The material Melita Norwood provided to Soviet intelligence during the 1940s and early 1950s included technical research relevant to the British atomic weapons program. Some of it overlapped with research being shared between British and American scientists under the partnership frameworks of the war years. Some of it was specific to British metallurgical and material science work that informed the practical construction of nuclear devices. Intelligence historians debate the precise operational weight of her individual contribution. The Soviet atomic program drew from multiple intelligence streams simultaneously. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were passing American material from inside the United States. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working at Los Alamos, was delivering some of the most technically specific nuclear information the K.G.B. ever received. British agent Donald MacLean contributed high-level policy intelligence about Anglo-American nuclear cooperation. But what Melita Norwood provided was different in character. She was not a physicist. She was not delivering equations or theoretical diagrams. She was delivering the industrial and material science knowledge that sits between theoretical research and working weapons construction. She was, in the language of intelligence analysis, filling in the production picture, helping Soviet scientists understand not just the theory of a nuclear device, but the practical engineering pathway toward building one reliably and at scale. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic device in August 1949, years ahead of American intelligence estimates. The speed of that achievement stunned Western governance and reshaped the entire strategic balance of the Cold War. It ended any possibility of American nuclear monopoly. It forced a fundamental recalculation of every military and diplomatic assumption in Washington and London, and it was achieved according to the KGB's own internal assessments, with significant assistance from the network of British sources who had been feeding Moscow's scientific program throughout the decade. Melita Norwood was among those sources. Her contribution was acknowledged in internal Soviet documentation that would not come to light for another 50 years. She retired in 1972. She had been spying for 37 years. She continued attending Peacemont. She continued tending her garden. She corresponded with the campaign for nuclear disarmament in various socialist organizations. She grew older, she became a grandmother. She became in the eyes of everyone around her exactly what she appeared to be, a principled, stubborn, intellectually alive old woman with strong opinions about capitalism and a genuine talent for growing vegetables. The KGB never forgot her. In 1987, at the height of the Gorbachev era, Soviet intelligence quietly awarded her their highest civilian commendation. She accepted it and said nothing to anyone in England. Meanwhile, somewhere behind the Iron Curtain, a senior KGB archivist named Vasily Mitrokhin had spent years doing something extraordinary and dangerous. He had been systematically copying the most sensitive files in KGB headquarters and concealing them. Notes, summaries, names, code names, operational details, stretching back decades. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Mitrokhin made contact with British intelligence, defected to the United Kingdom, and delivered what became known as the Mitrokhin Archive, the most comprehensive intelligence coup of the post-Cold War era. The archive named Ola, it named Melita Norwood. British intelligence received Mitrokhin's material in 1992. They spent years assessing its content and scope. They knew about Melita Norwood. They knew exactly who she was and where she lived. They chose not to tell the public. It was not until September 1999, when Cambridge historian Professor Christopher Andrew published his book based on the Mitrokhin archive, that the name Melita Norwood became public knowledge. She was 87 years old. She was in her garden. She was pruning roses. What happened next was, in its own strange way, a final demonstration of everything that had protected Melita Norwood for 40 years. The tabloids arrived and called her the Granny Spy. Cameras crowded her front path. Reporters shouted questions from the pavement. And Melita Norwood, 87 years old, 4 feet 10 inches tall, white-haired and steady-handed, walked out of her front door and gave a statement. She said she had no regrets. She said she had acted out of conviction, because she believed that no single nation should hold a monopoly over the most destructive weapons ever created. She said she had been concerned that American nuclear dominance would make the world more dangerous. not less, and that a balance of power was preferable to unchecked supremacy. She said she had done what she believed was right. Then she went inside and made another cup of tea. The Crown Prosecution Service deliberated. The Home Secretary was consulted. Legal experts reviewed the case. The question before the British government was technically simple and morally enormous. Do you prosecute an 87-year-old grandmother for crimes committed before most of her prosecutors were born? They decided not to. The official reasoning cited her age, her health, and the public interest calculation that a prosecution would be disproportionate to any achievable outcome. The unofficial reasoning, which intelligence historians have discussed extensively since, included something more complicated. A prosecution would have required disclosing just how long British intelligence had known about her, including the 7 years between Mitrokhin's defection and her public exposure. That disclosure would have raised questions the government preferred not to answer in open court. Melita Norwood was never charged. She lived in the same house in Bexleyheath for the rest of her life. She continued her political correspondence. She continued her garden. She died in June 2005, at the age of 93. In the country she had spent 40 years working against, surrounded by neighbors who had never entirely known what to make of her. There is a version of Melita Norwood's story that intelligence analysts tell as a cautionary tale about insider threat, about the danger of the trusted support employee, about the extraordinary damage that a single ideologically motivated individual with consistent access can cause over decades. That version is entirely accurate. There is another version that her admirers in various socialist circles have told, that she was a principled woman of conscience who genuinely believed she was preventing catastrophe, who acted not for money or status or excitement, but because she thought she was doing the right thing. That version is also, in its own way, accurate. The question she leaves open is the one that has no clean answer. Did she make the world safer? Did the nuclear balance of terror that defined the Cold War, the mutual assured destruction doctrine that prevented either superpower from striking first, depend in some meaningful way on the secrets passed from a secretary's desk in London to Moscow Center? Some historians argue that the Soviet atomic program would have reached its conclusions without her, that the physics was inevitable, that the intelligence streams feeding Moscow were wide enough that closing one would not have mattered significantly. Others argue that the speed of Soviet nuclear development was genuinely decisive, that every year of American nuclear monopoly was a year of dangerous temptation for military planners who believed they were racing against time, and that the accelerated Soviet test in 1949 fundamentally changed the strategic calculus before that temptation could become action. Melita Norwood believed the second version, completely and without apology, until the day she died. What is not in dispute is this: she was among the most effective intelligence assets Britain produced in the entire Cold War, judged by any professional metric: duration of service, volume and quality of material passed, operational security maintained across 4 decades, total evasion of counterintelligence scrutiny. She was more successful than most of the men the intelligence services spent their careers worrying about. She was more disciplined than agents with far more professional training and institutional support. She operated for nearly 4 decades without a single serious error, and she did it all while appearing to be exactly what the people around her assumed she was: an ordinary woman, unremarkable, unthreatening, easily overlooked. That is the lesson her handlers at Moscow Center understood and the British security services failed to learn for 40 years. The most dangerous people in the world are not always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they're the ones nobody is looking at all. She is buried in Bexleyheath. Her grave does not mention the Soviet Union, or the K.G.B, or the atomic secrets, or the code name Ola. It records that she was a wife, a mother, a grandmother. Every word of that is true, and none of it comes close to the whole story.